Welcome back. It's 4:46. I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News. Now, a leading polling expert has given a scathing prediction for the Tories in the next general election, saying they only have a 1% chance of winning. Now, you can do the maths. That means Labour has a 99% chance of forming the next administration. Now, Professor Sir John Curtis's prediction is correct. Well, I'm joined now by the Shadow Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh. Louise, welcome to the show. So there we go. You're 99%. You're nailed on, guaranteed to be the next leading party, if you believe Sir John Curtis. Is the champagne on ice?
Very, very far from it. And I think some of these polls have been really quite massively overstated. And look, I think there is undeniably a sense in the country that they want change and that they have that they're royally fed up of after 14 years of Conservative chaos and austerity. And that, frankly, none of our public services are working in the way that they were when Labour last left government in 2010, whether we think about our NHS, our education system, our police service, certainly not our transport system. So people are undeniably crying out for change, but there is zero complacency in the Labour ranks. And we know that elections have been lost in the past when polls have looked this high in the run-up to it. So we know we will be working for and fighting for every single vote when Rishi Sunak finally gets the courage to call a general election.
OK, Louise, we've seen brutal stabbings on the British Transport Network yesterday in London. We've been contacted by many, many viewers today saying they simply believe that the transport, in particular the train networks in Britain, are becoming so dangerous. People are now afraid to travel on them. In fact, even British Transport Police themselves saying they often feel overwhelmed. As the Shadow Transport Secretary, Louise, what will the Labour Party do to pledge to make our public transport situation safer and much more viable for the public, who are getting increasingly terrified to even use it?
I think there's such an important question, Martin, and I'm a former special constable myself. I was a police officer in Brixton in South London. I know how important policing and neighbourhood policing is to the safety of our streets, but also what an important job the British Transport Police do. Unfortunately, they, just like our wider police, have been subject to extraordinary cutbacks over the last 14 years, and only very recent times have those numbers started to creep up again. So Yvette Cooper, my colleague, the Shadow Home Secretary, has made commitments to increasing those numbers even further still and adding 16,000 additional police officers to the streets, which include the British Transport Police. But look, as a woman travelling, I often feel frightened myself, especially on the train at night. And that's why we campaigned hard against the closure of ticket offices and against the removal of guards on trains, because let me tell you, if you're travelling late at night and there are big groups of rowdy men, perhaps after a football match, or indeed men on their own that look pretty sinister, you want to know that there is a guard on the train, that there is someone that you can get hold of, that you can call BTP and they will be there at the next station. It is a really important principle, and the safety of the travelling public will be at the heart of our rail reforms, which I'm setting out in the coming weeks.
And what would that look like operationally? Because if people just want somebody on the trains to keep them safe, there's a feeling now that crimes happen and then the cops just put calls out for, can you help us locate this person? Here's some CCTV. But how about actually getting into the networks and stopping this? We had a report on GBNews.com. Mark White went undercover with the British Transport Police. And we know routinely transport networks now are the arteries of county lines. Drugs use and weapons, drugs, they're absolutely endemic. They are rife on our transport networks, which is being used by drug mules, heavily armed, dangerous men. That surely needs specific interventions, Louise.
That's absolutely right. And BTP must work properly with wider police forces. But ultimately, these issues come about because children, as you've just said, are victims of county lines themselves, and they are picked up by organised criminal gangs. So we need to make sure that we have sufficient neighbourhood policing in our communities as well as wider youth provision in order to protect young people from being subject to these kind of grooming, essentially, by organised criminal gangs. So it does need to be a real multi-pronged approach. And it is because we've lost so many of these services in our communities that our young people are particularly vulnerable. But investment and protection of staff on our rail network is absolutely essential, and as I say, will be fundamental to our rail reforms in terms of putting passengers at the heart, because our privatised rail industry over the last 30 years has never put the travelling public first, and that will be at the centrepiece of what the next Labour government will do on our railways.
And Louise, briefly, you mentioned before that you'd like the Labour Party to perhaps renationalise the rail networks. Is that still your option? And how would that work alongside this beefed-up security presence?
Well, Labour are committed to bringing in the private operators back into public ownership as those contracts expire, and all of them are set to expire within the potential first term of a Labour government. So it will be at no cost to the taxpayer. And then we need to reform the railways further so that they actually deliver for passengers. At the moment, you've got so many conflicting industries across the industry, whether it be the private operators like Avanti that are letting the travelling public down on a daily basis, and they are in conflict in so many ways with Network Rail, the infrastructure provider. So we will set out plans to reform our railways, to bring track and train together and make sure that the interests of the passenger are at the heart, because at the moment, as I say, the passenger always comes last on our privatised, fragmented and fractured railway network.
OK, great stuff. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. And that's Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Haigh.